So I think we will make a start because we have a very full agenda today, and no doubt people will be coming in and dropping out as the day progresses. Once again, just to introduce myself, I'm Peter Woodward. I'm an independent moderator with a passion for productive conversations that move us towards more sustainable development. So it's a great privilege for me to be part of this conversation over these 2 days and part of this project. Just a couple of words of housekeeping at the start. So if we can put the next slide up. Just to remind us all that if you can make sure that your camera is off and you are muted through the day, except when we're going into a couple of breakouts to have a chance of some conversation. So obviously you then unmute and you can have the speaker on. We suggest that the speaker view is the best way of seeing who is talking and also seeing slides as they come up, and you can adjust the balance between slide and picture as you like, just by going to the sort of line between the two of those. And through the day, if you would either like to make a comment or ask a question via chat, you're welcome to do that. It's useful if you just say who you are and just say question or comment. That is really useful for us just to know where you're coming from. If there are any issues through the day, if you on the chat function want to either tap in Alexander Gruff or Noah Barriere, they will be around to help you on the chat function if you have a problem. So that's your position to connect with the organizing team here. So that's some logistics for now, and also to reinforce that the day's proceedings are being recorded and for use within the project. So we've got a very full agenda, as I said this morning. We've got 3 key sessions, building on yesterday, where we were looking at some of the front runners and the alliances, and also looking at the overall kind of framing of that journey towards responsible sourcing. We're obviously building on practice over the last few years, and the urgency and the significance of this agenda is clearly increasing by the hour, by the day. And through today's conference, we're looking at a couple of particular areas. One is that interplay between regulations and the work of policymakers and standards and codes being developed by industry and alliances of industry. So we're going to look at that interplay. We're also going to think about the significance of the whole financial and investment community in driving the shift towards more responsible sourcing. What are the levers, what's happening, and where is that whole drive taking us, and what more could be done to utilize that influence of responsible sourcing. And then a very important session at the end, we're really going to try and draw the strands together of some of the discussions we've had over the last 2 days, really to be thinking about what's this telling us, and kind of where do we go from here, and also informing on some of the work that the resourcing project will be doing during its 4-year period. So very full agenda. We've got a couple of breaks to allow you to have a little bit of refreshment, but hopefully we will find a lot of high value. Just a reminder that presentations with permission from speakers will be available after the conference, the PowerPoint presentations, and there will be an outcomes report. And also just a further reminder, do use the chat function if you feel there's a comment or an issue that it's important to note, because we will be taking note of all the chat as well as we go through. So that's the plan for the morning. What I'd like to do now is to take us into session 4, which is under the heading Regulations and Standards. And this really is a focus on that interplay between the whole policy setting that's taking place by international and national governments, regional, local in many respects as well, and the whole growth of standards, codes of practice, alliances that is taking place, often very much driven by business, and thinking, okay, these are two drivers of change towards responsible sourcing. Do they fit together? Do they work well? Are they mutually supportive? Or is in fact, is there tension, and that's an uncomfortable relationship? Just to start us off, we're going to take a risk, and we're going to see whether we'd like to just have a couple of polling questions to just get your take on this. So I'm hoping that coming up in the chat function now, there we are, it says, please follow this link for the polling. So we've got a couple of questions. So if you click on that link, you should come up with a polling question. And what we'd like you to do is just click on that link and answer the question. So the first question is, in your opinion, how effective is the current action on business standards stroke public policy for responsible sourcing in responding to the growing societal challenges we face? So you will know out there, we've got the challenge of climate change, we've got issues around inequality, you know, the raft of sustainability issues. What we'd like is your opinion on how effective current action through business standards and public policy is for responsible sourcing in responding to the growing societal challenges we face. And you can slide that slider along from the left-hand side, which says wholly ineffective. We're just not fit for purpose for the challenges that we are aware of, right through to wholly effective. We're fit for purpose. Obviously, there's more room for development, but yeah, we're there. You know, we're given the circumstances, we're doing everything that should and we could do. So I'll just give a moment or two for you to reflect on that. So how effective is the current action on business standards stroke public policy for responsible sourcing in responding to the growing societal challenges that we face? And the results are still coming in. So again, if it's confusing you, there's a link on chat, which you just click on in order to find that question. Okay. So I think what we will do is see whether we can see the result of that first poll. So if you could put that up for us, that would be great. So there we are, on a scale really kind of from 1 to 10. There's a feeling that we are a little bit somewhat behind. So we're not wholly ineffective, but we're not wholly effective. We're more towards the less effective. So we need to hold that in our thoughts as we go through to the discussions a little bit later on. Okay, what I'd like to do is to just go to our second polling question. So we're looking at that interplay between industry standards and public policy. So what's the best balance between industry standards and public policies on responsible sourcing in addressing societal challenges? So should it? Yeah, let industry work it out. They know what's going on. We'll have industry standards. They're the ones who are really trying to explore these issues and work out the right thing. So it should be, the balance really should be towards the whole raft of industry alliances and standards, through to at the other end, look, these are society issues. It should really be public policy making that are setting the requirements, the framework very clearly within which business should operate, bearing in mind the reality of the globe that we are operating within. What do you sense would be the best balance between industry standards and public policies on responsible sourcing in addressing societal changes? So again, just click on that link for the polling and just move the cursor along to where you would like it to be. Just a moment or so for you to reflect, because this will also give us an indication of where we need to apply pressure and influence to get more happening. Okay, so I think, now again, if we can put the results up there. Right, so that's interesting. On that one, there's a sense that really there is a very significant role for the public government, public policy sphere to be right involved in this, in setting those policies and standards within which we operate. So interesting. So 4.1 for the first question and 6.7 for the other. Obviously, this is just a poll of those who've participated, so we shouldn't read too much into it, but I hope it might actually inform some of the conversation that is now going to take place. So we're going to develop this in two ways. I've got a couple of keynote presentations really to set the scene and to throw some thoughts into the pot. We're going to have an opportunity for you just to share some of your thoughts and experiences in breakout groups. And then I've got a panel who are going to discuss the issues that are arising in more detail. So I'm delighted this morning to be joined by Tyler Gillard from the OECD. And Tyler, great to have you with us. I know you were very much involved in developing the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains of minerals from conflict affected and high risk areas. You've been involved in this whole sphere for a considerable amount of time. So great to have you with us. Obviously, so many people look to OECD to be providing those frameworks. And just very interested to have your take on really how this whole scene is emerging and how those instruments, due diligence, etc., are developing and responding to the enormous increase in demand and challenges that we're all facing. So, Tyler, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that introduction. Good morning, everybody. And judging by those polling results, particularly the first one, clearly we have our work cut out for us still. And I think that's not surprising when you look at the state of play. So yes, my name is Tyler Gillard. I lead our work on due diligence in the Responsible Business Conduct Center. And it's a real pleasure to speak to you today and actually take this opportunity to take a step back and reflect on the state of play and the role of standards and policies in driving responsible sourcing and getting at the outcomes that we all want. And I think it's important to take that look, and are we pushing in the same direction or are we pulling each other apart? Are we in a sort of wild jungle of standards and certification initiatives and drivers, or are we in a well-organized machine that's all driving in the same direction? I think in order to, I don't know if I have all the answers to that for you today. And I don't have a PowerPoint. I just wanted to talk a little bit about my experience and my reflections. And in order to answer that question, I think it's important to first start off by looking at the drivers of responsible sourcing. And I know you spoke a little bit about that yesterday. But I want to look at this also from the angle of how do those drivers affect the various standards and policies that are emerging? And what dilemmas and trade-offs do we encounter when we're trying to reconcile those various drivers? When I look through the drivers and the state of play, we'll see that the state of play is a bit of a mess, but we do see some organization to it. And I'll finish talking then about what lessons have we learned from this whole journey that we've been on. So starting with the drivers, and as I said, it is important to reflect again on what is driving responsible sourcing in the mineral and metal supply chain space. And we see that there's really a diversity of drivers. You have consumers, you have investors, you have mid and downstream markets, which might have their own objectives and aims. You have regulations, and you have politics, clearly. And each of those are pulling in slightly different ways. And that is really important when thinking about the state of play of standards and what we can do to reconcile it, because we are aiming at meeting the expectations of a number of different stakeholder groups, and you have communities in there as well. So when you look at consumers, of course, consumers themselves, may not have a huge, high, and in-depth complex awareness of responsible sourcing challenges. Many consumers, particularly in OECD-based countries, particularly within the kind of millennial group, do hold a lot of value in responsible sourcing, but their awareness of the different challenges varies considerably. So if they've seen the movie Blood Diamond, they know about some of the issues around conflict, and particularly around diamonds. If they're following the Paris Agreement and the climate change, as many young consumers are, they're aware of the need to reduce emissions in global supply chains. But they don't really understand how this marks back to different metals or to different certification initiatives. And perhaps that's a good thing. Perhaps it's not really in the consumer's space to be making these calls. When you turn to the investors, another big driver of the work here, you see that they're also very much focused on long-term value in their portfolios and mitigating the financial or material risk to their portfolios in the first instance. They also might have social and economic objectives around climate, or in some cases making a positive impact. When you look to mid and downstream markets, their drivers are going to be rather different in this space. They're going to be looking at price stability, about security of supply, and about managing reputational risk so that they can sell their goods onward to, whether it's the car industry or it's the jewelry industry. And in the regulatory space, you see they're more concerned about combating crime, anti-money laundering, terrorist financing, sanctions as well as emerging regulations that we're seeing, and I think we're going to get into, and I'll get into in a little bit. So there's really a bit of a diversity and fragmentation. And I think what that means is that how those drivers affect regulations and policies means that we're going to have global benchmarks, and particularly government-backed benchmarks that are developed with those various stakeholder groups, play a key role in trying to reconcile those drivers, and trying to create a level playing field so that we're all speaking the same language. I think about a little bit like making a recipe for making a pie. And in order to have a recipe that's a good recipe, we need to all agree on the measurements, that a teaspoon is a teaspoon. And we also all need to agree on the ingredients, that we're calling the ingredients the same things, that flour is this kind of flour and sugar is this kind of sugar. And then we need the recipe to make our perfect pie. I don't think we're at a space now where we have the perfect recipe, but I think we are at a space now where we're all speaking the same language around the ingredients and about our measurements. And that is a key necessary first step in order to push towards convergence and alignment on responsible sourcing standards. Now, when thinking about those drivers and the diversity of the drivers that are emerging and how that plays on standards, and whether we're going towards convergence or fragmentation, it's also important to think about some of the dilemmas that emerge and the trade-offs that are emerge. I know now when thinking about responsible sourcing, we are all aiming for win-win approaches. Of course, approaches that work for consumers, that work for producers, that work for business, that work for communities on the ground, that work for governments. And many times that might be possible. But unfortunately, the fact of the matter is that sometimes trade-offs and dilemmas really do exist, that there are things that businesses need to prioritize, and that might come at a cost of something else, which is a priority for a different stakeholder or group or one of those drivers themselves. So, of course, when you're looking at sourcing from artisanal and small scale miners, you have on the one hand, the dilemma that sourcing from these miners, largely informal group, might mean that they are more susceptible and vulnerable to risks like child labor, exploitation from criminal groups or armed groups on the ground, serious health and safety conditions. On the other hand, sourcing from artisanal miners gives major opportunities for impact investing. It also gives purely business opportunities for as a swing producer or as a spot market for different metals. So that's a dilemma. That's a trade-off. Are you looking to meet the demands of investors or consumers that want to make a positive impact on livelihoods and support tens of millions of workers, poor people working on the ground? Or are you wanting to provide a guarantee that no product is associated with child labor 100%? And is that even possible? So that's a dilemma. That's a real trade-off. When you're looking at sourcing from large-scale industrial mines, or you're thinking about recycled mines, it's a similar trade-off. Are we looking to source new material, or are we which has its own risks around water use, health and safety, impact on the environment and communities? Or are we going to source purely recycled material, which brings its own raft of risks around chemical use and leaching in the recycling process? These are not easy questions. And I guess I start with all this because my point really is that global benchmarks, so globally agreed frameworks, really help to resolve and reconcile these dilemmas and trade-offs. If they're done well, and that's a big if they're developed with business and with communities, stakeholders, consumers, and governments, they should help to bring some clarity so that we all have the same understanding of the ingredients and the measurements behind the perfect responsible sourcing pie. And of course, a big element of how to reconcile those dilemmas is about transparency and public reporting, about making sure that when those trade-offs are made, that they're very clearly reported out to the various users of that information. So with that understanding, where do I see the state of play of standards and certification initiatives? You see that we have global benchmarks, which are sort of the government-backed, intergovernmental-backed standards like the EITI initiative, like perhaps the voluntary principles on security and human rights, like the OECD due diligence guidance. That's sort of one layer. Then you have various industry and multi-stakeholder standards. That's kind of a little layer. And those standards are sort of often private sector driven, but really aim to implement some of those global benchmarks or global conventions and rules. And sitting alongside that is regulatory space. So those trio of global benchmarks, standards, and regulations have changed dramatically in this space in the last 10 years. Before 2010, you would be hard pressed to see specific supply chain legislation and specific dedicated industry or multi-stakeholder initiatives dedicated to responsible supply chains of metals. I think if you look back pre-2010, you have issues like, of course, the responsible mining world, which had been evolving for a number of years, like I work around the ICMM, World Gold Council, and even the Responsible Jewelry Council, really an innovator in this space. But you didn't really have a global understanding of how producers, processors, and consumers cooperate. What is their shared responsibility in order to drive responsible sourcing and production on the ground? And I think, of course, I'm biased, but at the OECD, that is a space and an area that we really filled quite early on. In 2010, we began work focusing on developing a global framework for responsible sourcing of metals from conflict-affected and high-risk areas. Now, that latter point is important because the OECD's first impetus for working on this was looking at issues around serious risks, the most severe risks that you would find in conflict areas. So whether that's conflict financing, severe, serious human rights abuses, serious financial crime like money laundering, terrorist financing, or bribery. So the driver for the work at the OECD was this kind of narrow risk scope, and it really came out of Central Africa. But we were the first place to set a global benchmark that was developed with industry, with civil society, and then endorsed by governments worldwide. And I think coming first in that respect really helped. Now, that wasn't important enough just to develop that global benchmark. In order for it to be implemented, we needed regulation. Regulation in the form of Section 1502 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which really focuses on Central Africa and conflict, but nonetheless provided a huge impetus for downstream industry to come to the table and agree to work with midstream producers and upstream producers and agree on a common language, which was at that point the OECD framework. So there is this major interplay. And since 2010, we have seen an explosion of supply chain initiatives, both focused on the metal sector, but also generically. And that is being coupled with an explosion of global benchmarks that are government-backed, notably that non-sector specific. We have the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and we have OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, general codes of conduct for business, not sector specific. And we have this huge plethora of certification initiatives since 2010 that are being adopted or being developed. Some that are focused on auditing choke points in that supply chain, so metal producers, like the Responsible Mineral Initiative, like the London Bullion Market Association's Responsible Gold program, like the Dubai Multi-Commodity Center gold program, really focused at looking at that choke point in the supply chain and making sure they're sourcing correctly. But you also have initiatives that are trying to certify mines and entities at each point in the supply chain, from the mine to consumers, and create a sort of chain of trust all the way to consumers, so every entity is certified. The OECD, of course, our approach tends to focus on dividing the upstream between the supply chain between upstream and downstream. Upstream being from mine to refiner, and then downstream being all the users of the metals. And each of those bodies having different and reinforcing responsibilities. So when looking at the state of play, are we in a jungle or are we in a well-oiled machine? And what are some of the lessons that we've learned? Well, as I said, there is a major increase in regulations and expectations now. A lot of this has galvanized around the OECD due diligence framework as the sort of the foundational benchmark, but many understandably are also going beyond the OECD framework. And that makes sense. And I think from the OECD's perspective, we see the OECD due diligence framework as really a floor, not a ceiling for initiatives. And that it really is a starting point to help companies that are downstream deal with those dilemmas and prioritize. But it is definitely not the end of the journey for responsible sourcing. And as we at the OECD roll out our framework to other metals, and as we try to push it out, we see that we are constantly grappled with the challenges of ensuring flexibility for different industries to find their own solutions and consistency globally. And that consistency is critical because of the different drivers that I started speaking about. We need to have a language where we can talk to each of those groups. But also just because downstream markets don't think in terms of, aluminum and steel and tin and gold. If you're a downstream user and a heavy manufacturer of metals, you need a common language for everything. So I think where we are now is that we are still on that journey. And a big challenge of that journey is not so much in the technical standards, are they fit for purpose? Because in our experience, when trying to now grow the implementation of the OECD framework to issues like new metals, like base metals, what we've seen is not so much that they're not fit for purpose. Generally they are, but that there's a lot of work to be done in building ownership and understanding amongst the community and that metal community. Every time we start a new metal, we need to start at the same conversation of trying to raise awareness and understand the challenges that that metal faces, but more importantly, help them build ownership in the process so that they can implement it. The most perfect solution, if it's not owned from the ground up, from those that are implementing it, won't work. And I think that's still where we are now. In my view, the frameworks we have, the standards we have, are fit for purpose for a range of different metals. But we still have a major challenge ahead of us in terms of raising awareness and building that ownership amongst different metal communities so that they can understand and actually implement and take this forward. Also, I think one thing that's important to bear in mind when thinking about where we are now is the politicization of this place. When I started this work 15 years ago, the metals industry wasn't as politicized as it is today. And that's partially because we recognize the importance of sourcing of metals for the transition. And I think obviously with the Paris Agreement, the world, including financial markets, has come to realize that the crisis ahead of us in terms of climate will require massive upscaling of mining and metal production. This has put a lot of political pressure on critical materials. And this has also created a geopolitical environment where trade discussions are not always easily reconciled at a very technical level. So I think I've come to the end of my 15 minutes. The state of play is that we are in still a little bit of a jungle, but I think we're speaking the same language. We have a common language for communicating between producing, processing, and consuming countries. Different metals are operating at different speeds still. There's a long history of responsible mining that we still need to connect with the supply chain aspect. And I think we are just on that journey. And, you know, Peter, I really look forward to hearing from the panel and also to taking some of these lessons back to the OECD ourselves to see what can we do better. And I want to hear from other panelists in order to help support this convergence and alignment and avoid further fragmentation. So I look forward to the remarks, and I hope that was helpful in setting the scene. And thank you very much, everybody.
Tyler, that's really great. Thank you very much. A great introduction. And I think that's going to stimulate a lot of discussion among our participants and the panels. And I think you rightly highlight that this is a pivotal moment. Suddenly there's this rush, both of demand to do the right thing and demand for more metal, but also increased transparency and how we work our way through those various dilemmas. So I'll certainly open up some of those conversations in the panel. What we'd like to do is just add in a case study from one of those alliances that is trying to get standards organized within a sector. And I'm delighted that we're joined this morning by Fiona Solomon, who's CEO of the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative. Aluminium, one of the great success stories in terms of reuse in many respects. So it fits gloriously into every conversation about circular economy, but we are still have a huge demand for new metal. So Fiona, great to have you with us, and just be very interested to hear a little bit about the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, and also your take on the kind of state of play and maybe some of the issues and messages we need to be wrestling with as we try and take responsible sourcing forwards. Over to you, Fiona.
Thanks, Peter. And it's a pleasure to be here with you all and to have the opportunity to talk about the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, or ASI. Next slide. I don't have control. So next slide, please. Thank you. So the first point to make about ASI is that we do cover the whole aluminium value chain. I think Tyler gave us a great kind of sense of some of those variables and dynamics, and a really key point for ASI is the complexity and the number of steps in the supply chain, and the fact that our standards cover all of those. So for those who aren't familiar, if you're starting with mined material, you start with bauxite mining, you take that through a refining process to produce alumina, or white powder. That then goes through an electrolysis process where the aluminium is smelted as primary metal, and that metal then goes into semi-fabrication stages, which produce certain standardized kind of products like rolled or extruded or cast products that go into specific manufacturing routes for different product and sector applications, ranging from automotive, building, construction and infrastructure, packaging, different kinds of consumer goods, and so on. And at the end of those lives of those various products, which might be as short as 6 weeks for an aluminium can to 100 years in a building. We want to obviously maximise the collection of that scrap to support the circular economy principle. So scrap collection, refining and remelting of that scrap so it can start a new life as other aluminium products that are useful for us as society. Next slide, thanks. So ASI's vision is to maximise the contribution of aluminium to a sustainable society. We aim to do that through our certification program primarily, which seeks to recognise and collaboratively foster responsible production, responsible sourcing and stewardship of aluminium through the whole supply chain. Next. So a brief history on ASI can really be divided into 3 stages. First, a multi-stakeholder group came together to ask what could or should be done in this space of responsible aluminium. The second stage, which was hosted under the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, was really asking, is it possible to build multi-stakeholder consensus on what responsible aluminium is, what everybody's responsibility is through the supply chain? And then the third stage was really, let's go, let's make it happen. And that's where I joined in 2015, and we set to work formalising the governance, which is a really important part of these programs, the design of the certification program itself, rolled out the operations and built momentum and uptake. So now, where we're in January 2021, we have more than 150 members through the supply chain and across our different membership classes, more than 100 certifications, and a really strong feeling of momentum, which is terrific. Next, thanks. So I'll explain a little bit about our 6 classes of membership. We have 2 classes. You heard Tyler talk about upstream and downstream. Our upstream is really our production and transformation membership class, and our downstream is what we call industrial users. And companies that join in those classes must seek certification for at least some part of their business against our performance standard within 2 years of joining ASI. We also have as full members civil society organisations. So those 3 classes represent our full members that can nominate to our board and to our standards committee. We also have associate members, which include industry associations, wherever they are or whatever they represent, but with an interest in aluminium. We have downstream supporters, which could be industrial users, but they're perhaps not yet ready to seek certification. They might be seeking to understand a little bit better what ASI is about. They might be working with their supply chain to put supply in place before they take the step themselves at the end of the supply chain as a downstream user towards certification. And then we have a kind of a catch-all category around general supporters. And we've had quite a lot of organisations like trading companies and so on joining in that space. And ASI, we talked a little bit about regulation, industry standards, policy standards. We are a multi-stakeholder organisation. We're a voluntary standard system. So members join voluntarily, even if they join within the certifying classes, that's a voluntary decision. But once they join, obviously there's this minimum commitment that's in place. We also have a chain of custody standard, which is voluntary, but we're finding that the uptake of that is really good. And we have no plans to make it more mandatory than what it is. I think Tyler laid out really well that standard systems are ultimately not regulators, but they both have complementary roles to play. We can support where public policy, where international benchmarks are in place, and play that really implementing role. And by demonstrating value, by demonstrating impact, that's the way in which scale can be built to serve a multiple of stakeholder expectations. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so on our website, we maintain a list of different kind of data that's available on some key outcomes that we're tracking. This data is from mid-December. And just a few points out of that. Obviously, you can have a look at more what's there, but you can get a sense of, so far we've had 74 certifications issued against the performance standard, 28 against the chain of custody standard. We've had more since this data was published. And an interesting point, again, drawing on from Tyler's point around how we find those connection points between different programs, we have found that 92% of our performance standard certifications leverage one or more other certifications. Usually these are ISO standards, but the key point really is that programs like ASI can draw in, other programs and seek to add value, connect those together, particularly for organizations that are vertically integrated in the supply chain, and really go beyond like a single issue or a single sector or a single supply chain moment or activity to connect that piece within a supply chain context. Next, thanks. So this slide shows the distribution of some of the certifications that we've got through till November last year, through those supply chain stages that we looked at the start. That distribution is really solid and pleasing from our point, and it shows not just with the spread that we've got, but also that we're finding companies that certify keep adding in new facilities, they expand the scope of what they have, they add in chain of custody, and that demonstrates to us that they're finding value in ASI. And the kind of value or benefits that they find might be related to actual practice improvements and practical changes that they're making at a site or corporate level, perhaps market access, reputation is certainly one, and also meeting customer and of course regulatory requirements. So in reflection, if I think about what are some of the success factors for ASI, I think that would be that we've been proactive rather than reactive in setting up the program in the first place. There wasn't a crisis or a blood diamonds kind of analogy, as Tyler mentioned in his presentation, but instead just the open question about how can aluminium contribute? What is responsibility and sustainability in the context of this commodity? We were multi-stakeholder governance from inception. I think the whole of supply chain approach is powerful, and it really supports and triggers that B2B drivers. By having a focus on aluminium through that supply chain, we are tailored to the key risks and the materiality for aluminium. We take a really rigorous approach to program development. On one of the earlier slides, it mentioned that we're a full member of the ICL Alliance, for example, so we comply with their codes for good practice on standard setting, assurance and impacts and so on. We have always taken a focus on innovation, and particular through investment in digital tools. So we've tried to make sure that our online assurance platform, Elemental, and our online learning platform, Educational, can really scale and support those, in a variety of places. And that's been particularly important, obviously, with the last 12 months with the pandemic. Next, thank you. So let's reflect a little bit on this responsible sourcing question, and I feel that I'm ending up echoing Tyler a little bit here. There are many dimensions to this question. If we think first around communities and consumers, there's questions around, at a local level, at a mining level, is there an equitable distribution of impact and benefit? If we're thinking about circular economy questions, we're really asking what's the right material choice here for an application? How do we take a life cycle view and make sure that we support the circularity, particularly of metal? And from a consumer point of view, we've introduced within ASI an on-product logo under a chain of custody standard. And since I'm a practice example, I actually have an actual practical example on an aseptic carton here. But consumer drivers for both product choice and packaging are another interesting dimension. None of these are the sole driver, but they're all part of that picture. And I have some more on the next slide as well. We also have the markets and the investment and the regulatory side. Tyler talked about the OECD due diligence guidance that work within kind of conflict mineral space, if you like, started with that focus on tin, tungsten, tantalum and gold, or 3TG, and OECD and others are increasingly doing work about expanding that out to other metals, and aluminium has had that within its standard, but we're now in the standards revision we're doing at the moment, looking to more closely align with that as part of, for example, the LME, setting out their responsible sourcing requirements for their LME listed brands. And of course, for aluminium, a really big issue is greenhouse gas intensity, particularly for the energy intensive smelting stage. There are low carbon claims, there's low carbon trading platforms emerging, there's massive investment that's needed to decarbonise generally. Aluminium has a role to play in things like electricity generation, solar generation, a whole range of the technologies that can be there. There's technology investment in the smelting process itself that needs to happen, and obviously at a national and a grid level as well. So next slide. So the key I sort of wanted to end on there is really the importance of taking a comprehensive approach. So ASI aims to focus on a really wide range of sustainability issues. Carbon intensity, for example, is getting a lot of focus within aluminium, but it's not the only sustainability challenge for this metal. And addressing one issue in isolation can have unintended consequences. For example, perhaps people would say, well, let's make sure we locate everything next to hydropower or develop new hydropower developments, but that can of course result impact and resettlement of Indigenous peoples, and other kinds of environmental impacts. I think the other piece around ASI, because we're one commodity feeding into such a wide variety of downstream use applications, there's some really interesting opportunities for multi-industry learning, particularly on things like recycling strategies, emissions reductions, life cycle assessments, human rights, due diligence approaches, and so on. And we have a number of active working groups that are exploring those spaces and sharing learnings across sectors and across with NGO input as well. So my last slide, and hopefully I've kept to my 10 minutes. Thanking you. There's heaps more on our website to find out more about us, but in summary, we believe we've got a really robust program, that the whole of supply chain approach is really key. We've got this strong momentum, and we expect this to be another big year for us as well. We're doing a major standards revision at the moment. It started last year, and we'll be doing a couple of big consultation periods this year. So I encourage anyone who's interested in the content of our standard or have certain views on things that should be achieved to take the opportunity to contribute to those revision processes and to those public comment periods. And yeah, we really are looking to have that impact through implementation and to kind of work together at where these interstitial spaces between public policy, regulatory, the industry and multi-stakeholder standard space can really feed off each other and reinforce each other. So I'll leave it there and look forward to further discussion in the panel session. Thanks, Peter.
Fiona, thank you very much. A very clear picture of what's developed over a number of years as a very comprehensive approach. And Fiona, we'd like you to join us on our panel in a few moments as we really try to explore some of those issues further, really about that balance between regulation and standards, and also the pace of evolution of this as the growing spotlight on responsible sourcing really intensifies. So thank you very much.
Pleasure.
What I'd like to do is, in order to feed our panel, which we've got a mixed stakeholder panel to discuss some of these issues, but in the spirit of resourcing, we really want this network to be having conversations themselves and feeding thoughts in. So what we're going to do is invite you to join a short breakout group. So there we'd expect 7 people randomly distributed in breakout groups. And this really is a chance for you to share some of your experiences with others. So the way it will happen is very simple. Once we're going to randomly allocate you into a group of about 7 people, might be fewer, depends, we'll see what happens. If you unmute and turn on your camera, just do a brief round of introductions. And then we'd like you to really just share your own perspectives, experiences on this topic of that interplay between mandatory public policy and voluntary business standards. What issues are working in your mind? What experience do you bring? And what we'd really like is for that to fuel the panel discussion that will come up afterwards. So at the end of your conversation, we'd like you to choose somebody who's going to write a key insight or a question for the panel to discuss through afterwards. So we're driven by the experience and intelligence of our participants. So we're going to break into those groups now, and you've got 15 minutes for that discussion. Please hang on in there and do join in, whatever your level of experience. It's good for you to be unmuted and turn your camera on so you can be part of that conversation. And we'll see you back in 15 minutes time, and then I'll open up the panel discussion. So breakout groups will commence now. So we are heading back into the plenary and a panel discussion. Welcome back, everyone. If you have been in one of the breakout groups, if you can make sure you turn off your camera and you're muted. And if you're the person who's been nominated to feed back a question or a comment to the panel discussion, then if you can please make something succinct in the chat section, and then we will come on to you fairly shortly. We've got about 40 minutes for some further discussion. So hope that will very much be nourished by the breakout discussions. The breakouts are an experiment. We're all learning on Zoom and other platforms as to whether this really offers the chance of some interchange or whether it's an annoyance. And I'm sure you'll be able to give some feedback at the end of this conference. So I'd like to introduce our panel for some further conversation. Tyler and Fiona are rejoining us, so great to have you as part of the conversation. And also would just like to introduce Rebecca Burton. Rebecca is from the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, so is very much connected into this subject area. Great to have you with us, Rebecca. Bryce Lee is Director of CSR at Huayu Cobalt, I'm very much involved in the Chinese responsible cobalt process, so great to have you with us this morning, Bryce. And we also have Tobias Persson, who's a Senior Advisor in the Swedish Governmental Agency for Growth Policy Analysis, and is very much looking at how the Swedish government can play its role particularly in issues of traceability and labeling of sustainable metals and materials. So we've got a great panel here. Thank you all very much for joining us. What I'd like to do is to really come to our three panelists who've not yet said something, really to offer maybe some initial thoughts into the pot. So our conversation is around this interplay between public policy and business standards in taking us towards responsible sourcing. Is that balanced right? How do we make that work in the most effective way? And perhaps layer onto that is it feels that we are at an incredibly significant moment. We've never been more aware of the challenges that are facing us all. There's never been more in census transparency with the digital world of what's going on out there. So interested also in that sense of whether we are fit for purpose as we move forward. But maybe just some initial comments. Rebecca, if I could come to you first, what's your take on the conversation so far and your sense of this interplay?
Well, I hope it's okay, simply because Irma has been spoken of throughout the conference thus far in a couple of ways, and I think there are likely some in the audience who are unfamiliar with what we do. So before I answer your question, Peter, I hope it's okay if I just introduce us very quickly. So first I'll introduce myself. I'm the Director of Communications and Corporate Engagement at Irma. We were founded back in 2006. So just like Tyler spoke about in his opening remarks, at that time, there wasn't necessarily a global understanding of shared responsibility vis-a-vis the mining sector. And so civil society was asking purchasers, please source responsibly when it comes to mining. And purchasers said, okay, we will, but where? And how do we know if it's responsible? And there was sort of a looking around and realizing that actually a definition for what it means to mine responsibly had not necessarily been set yet at that time. And so what Irma did is it brought 5 stakeholder groups around the table. So that's mining, purchasing, labor, communities, and civil society, nonprofit groups, to define what it means to mine responsibly for all minerals and metals. And I'll actually draw on Tyler's pie analogy. I think it was a really good one. It actually took us 10 years to make Irma's pie, first to understand what were the ingredients, what needs to be covered. Labor, of course, needs to be there, but also noise, for example, water, waste, basically deciding what are all of the issues related to mining that need to be covered. Then how do you measure it? How do you actually assess if the practice is responsible? And that's where Irma developed very specific and detailed requirements. And then finally, you get the recipe. And that's ultimately what I would say the standard is. It lays out best practices, which actually has been referenced by mining companies as a guidebook on how to improve. And so Irma, ultimately, what came out of this 10-year process of working together, of creating this multi-stakeholder definition of what it means to mine responsibly, is that you have the most high bar standard that meets the expectation of NGOs and communities, while also being practicable, given that mining was at the table in its development. Again, it applies to all mines materials, and it covers all issues related to mining and offers equal stakeholder governance. And then I'll just say one final thing in terms of IRMA, because there's so much emphasis and focus on transparency, is that it really offers a level of transparency that hasn't yet been seen in the sector. So when an audit is going to happen, it's publicly noticed. We also do outreach to communities and organizations near the mine so that they can weigh in on an audit. And then the report that comes out is about 100 pages that details how the mine actually performed against each of the requirements in the standard. So it's really this insight into mine performance that we haven't yet seen before. And so what I want to say in terms of sort of the conversation, Peter, coming to your question, is that I think that this idea of just, let's look at, I'll just talk about OECD, for example, because we've already had a conversation about that and due diligence. And with Tyler saying OECD is just at the beginning, and it's sort of just asking companies, look at your supply chains, understand what's going on. And what I'll say is, it actually is effective. That ask is effective, because what we're seeing from our side, because we're a voluntary standard that ultimately is providing market value for mines to improve, what we're seeing is purchasers, those who use mined materials, are using that due diligence that is expected of them to look and really understand where are the biggest risks. And so when we're looking at IRMA, the mines that are coming into the system, the mining companies that are coming into the system, aren't necessarily the best performers that just want to come and say, look how well we're doing. It's actually some who have had more challenging reputational issues in the past. And so I would just say we're seeing that from the market level, just how effective it has been. So I'll just leave with that and look forward to more conversation.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to bring the other two panelists in before I then open up some of these issues. I come to you next, Tobias. So you're supporting and advising government in thinking about how they can introduce, particularly around traceability and labeling of sustainable metals and minerals. I mean, in Sweden, really strong emphasis and drive towards this. Just interested in your take on how this whole area is developing, and particularly the role that we're seeing from national governments in trying to drive forward the move towards responsible sourcing. So great to have you with us, Tobias. Few words from yourself.
Thank you, Peter, and I'm pleased to be invited to this conference. And also thanks, Tyler and Fiona, for the excellent presentation. It's much easier for me to have this talk. And of course, as we can see from this conference, we can see that responsive sources is under rapid development, and not least in my experience is that it's made possible also by modern IT solutions that enable monitoring of information or supply chains. It can be cloud computing or blockchain or sort. And my experience from the government side, and one of the biggest challenges is the risk of actually greenwashing, that incorrect or biased information is stuffed into these IT systems. And crucial point is what is sustainable, and to define that is very difficult, as it is subject to assumptions and values are needed. And I agree with Tyler that we have a common language around the framework of this system, but when you come into the details of how to define, for example, the carbon footprint, of how it shall be calculated, we don't agree, and a lot of money involved in that task. And also regarding the cycling and the use of metals, you have different methods to do that, which is difficult to agree with, but also can be how to make the trade-off between an investment reducing carbon mitigation, but have negative impact on biodiversity, which also is what you put into the system, which is very difficult. And of course, it's a lot of money involved in this business. So it's a great risk of rent seeking that companies and states have special interests and try to influence the process of standard and regulation. And this can, of course, be interpreted as mentioned yesterday, the power dynamics of this to get a level field. And based on my own work to deal with these difficulties with rent seeking, I think 3 measures is very important to bring in. And the first is the objective market analysis, that we have public available analysis that identify critical assumptions and how this can be affected by rent seeking and greenwashing. And secondly, there's also need of objective and transparent auditing of companies' sustainability work, and especially in a supply chain perspective, because normally what I have seen is that the branding company put demands on their supply, but after the first supplier, this requirement disappears. So it don't follow down to the supply chain. And this can also include the financial support to the research project actually dealing with to examine the sustainability transition of supply chains and mines, and for that sake also the process industry. And finally, I think it's also important to include small or medium-sized firms and also small stakeholders into the development of standards and certification system, because they often don't have the resources to spend and be involved in this, so they are neglected their interests. So that's my final recommendation to do when you come from the business side, for the government side, at least when dealing with these issues.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to draw some of those out in a moment, but I'm just going to bring Bryce Lee in from Huayu Cobalt. Great to have you with us this morning, Bryce. Again, just if you want to put a couple of thoughts into the space, and then we'll develop some discussion and flow. But you're obviously involved in the responsible Chinese responsible cobalt process. Just interested in your take on that interplay between government regulation and policies and business-led initiatives and standards. Over to you, Bryce.
Thank you so much, Peter. I just want to say hello to many of my old friends like Tyler. How are you? Mm-hmm. Hopefully you keep negative during the COVID-19 tests. So just briefly, I think I'm from the company side. So regarding policies and requirements, I just want to say I'm not against you. I just want to follow your regulations and recommendations. Then I just want to tell you, in reality, when we're trying to follow those guidances, what are the challenges we have, right? We are commercial side. And also, I just want to say hello to Rebecca from Elma. We have a lot of conversations with your standards because we want to implement it into our mine site. So number one, I think a lot of people told us artisanal mining shouldn't be shouldn't be under discrimination. But what is the reality? We have already heard a lot of specific, clear requests from our downstreams, big ones. No ASM cover, please. And also, some people they told us whatever we do, just no ASM. So as I'm saying, the guidance are guidance, but when it goes to realities, is different. And I think the guidance shouldn't be only regulations for companies. but also all stakeholders. I think, for example, the governments, relevant governments and association and NGOs, especially media. I think media play a lot of important roles in this work. If they say so, a lot of people knew because they are very public. But when they say or give wrong comments, how we can fight against it. So this is my first comment. The principles and guidance with the realities, that's a little bit the gap. But secondly, I just want to say, I think the guidance is, don't mistaken white cobalt. For example, we are the biggest cobalt producers in the world. We supply 45% of cobalt relevant materials in China and 20% globally. So our clients and Tesla and Volkswagen, all these big firms, including Apple, Huawei, everybody using lithium-ion batteries will probably using our cobalt. But as a company, when we want to say we want to follow responsible sourcing, we have the full commitment. My high level, my CEO said so. But when it goes to the detailed work, I think we do need specific standards with relevant tools. So my CEO can, for example, at the end of the year, they can evaluate my work to say so whether Bryce has done a good job or not. So otherwise they cannot. For a company, we cannot say we just want to go this direction without a specific target and also the tools to evaluate our work. So this is my second painful things. So Peter, that's exactly the reason why White Cobalt, as the vice chairman, we co-founded the Responsible Cobalt Initiative, RCI in China. So that's the full name. We hopefully we can develop industrial levels of standards and relevant tools for us to follow. So the next one is, as we can see, while you're representing upstream and even middle stream, so we supply to downstreams. In our daily operations, the requests always come from downstreams, as you can see. But I think sometimes even the downstreams, sometimes, for my knowledge, they have wrong policies and wrong request, which is against our policies, but I still have to follow. This is also my pain point. I think we do need a grievance mechanism or even arbitration mechanism. So where we can find a judge to say this company and their request is not right. My policy is better. There's no way I can find this place. So all these, I do have thousands of small comments and ideas, but I just want to stop here, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you, Peter.
That's great. Thank you very much. And I think what I want to do is try and open this up as a conversation. So if you want to chip in with something at any point, just among our panelists, just put a hand up and I'll bring you in. So rather than a sort of linear, if we can have a conversation, that's good. From everything that's been said, I mean, I just wanted to throw an initial thought in, and it's coming also from one of the breakout groups, in a sense where we're growing up here. You know, a number of years ago, you know, setting standards for responsible sourcing was quite a new thing. We've sort of, you know, that has developed. But in the early days, it was maybe, you know, we had ambitious ideas and somewhat opaque guidance. Now we're realizing that really to get good policy, good standards takes an awful lot of time and thought and stakeholder engagement. And I'd just be interested, I'll go to the first person who puts that hand up. I mean, the process of putting together appropriate standards or policies that are fit for purpose really takes time. It takes a multi-stakeholder approach. I just ask a question of whether you think, are we grown up enough and are we investing enough in really doing that job properly? Or are we sort of just doing enough to get away with it at the moment? Who'd like to respond to that? Rebecca, come to you, and then Fiona.
Just finding my unmute button here. I mean, yes, Peter, given the extensive time that we took, I mean, the reason that it took so long was, one, we had to, like I said, first see what are all of the issues that we were going to look at. And then as we went through, I'll be honest, there were particular issues that we ended up calling sticky issues, because they seem so entrenched in terms of how do you really bring together stakeholders to agree on what is best practice. And when you have a multi-stakeholder process, what you're always trying to balance is moving beyond the status quo to actually doing better. And on the other hand, also being practicable at the actual mine level. This has to be something that on a business level can also make sense. And so bringing those two together, so just to extrapolate on what the issues were, I mean, water and waste were two where we actually we had our board, but then we also had actual experts come in and really sit down together for hours at a time and to say, this is what it actually means to mine responsibly in a way that, again, pushes us to a better level, but is also something that a mine can actually achieve. And so, yes, I would say that in terms of actually defining the standards, I think this goes a little bit, Tyler, to what you said in terms of sort of the ingredients are there. I think there is some agreement on what it actually means to do these things responsibly. And so now it just comes down to the actual implementation, measuring, that type of thing. But I'll leave it to my colleagues to add more.
Fiona, and you may actually all want to stay unmuted if you want. We'll see if suddenly a dog starts barking, you can meet. But Fiona, again, a response to that challenge. We're not really fit for purpose in terms of what genuine stakeholder engagement in really developing quality standards around responsible sourcing. What's your response to that?
I mean, I think there's a spectrum of approaches to standard setting, some of which are more robust, some of which are more multi-stakeholder, some of which are less so or are driven by speed. I've been involved in many standard setting processes. I've been involved in the OECD one with Tyler. I've been involved in the Responsible Jewelry Council around gold. I was even involved in a mining one pre-IRMA that actually led to IRMA, led by WWF out of Australia. So all of those processes, it depends on the range of stakeholders at the table, the breadth of the issues, the depth of the issues, and the principles and the governance around those decision-making processes as well. So, what emphasis is built on consensus building versus more rapid decision-making, and they can have different weight depending on the kind of timescales and the urgency of the things that are being addressed. So, I agree that the standard setting is an important piece. If you're talking about standards programs or certification programs, or even the work that OECD have done, there's the standard piece, but there's also the assurance, which is really important. And of course, the bigger question is, are we creating change? Are we having an impact? And so, under ISEAL frameworks, for example, they're the three parts of the standard setting process. And if you spend heaps of time on standards, but you do a not great job on assurance, or you're not really having an eye on whether you're actually something's happening out of that, then you're unanchored and unbalanced, in terms of what you're trying to achieve.
Okay, I'll bring in Tyler and then Tobias.
Thanks. I think good questions, and also great stuff coming up in the chat as well. I would say, first of all, I think we have to really differentiate between, and I tried to in my remarks, but I think when we have global benchmarks, it's very different than like an implementable, auditable standard that people can assure themselves against. And I think you need a bit of both. I think you need, and obviously I'm biased because we've come from a process where, I think we've managed to push this out there. But, the OECD guidance it is general, and it is kind of at a higher level of extrapolation. It kind of put in place the what of responsible sourcing, but doesn't prescribe one how. It doesn't say exactly how you get there. It says, this is the information that's important to pass on to a downstream provider, but it doesn't say how you collect that, because we really believe that it's up to the different standards that are being developed that are fit for purpose in either a different geography or for different metals to develop that how. And that is going to be an iterative and dynamic ongoing process. I mean, I think if we're all fooling ourselves that we're going to be sitting around all holding hands, singing Kumbaya, agreeing on all the same stuff, that's impossible. We have a diversity and heterogeneous drivers and stakeholders that we're trying to meet. So what we need to have is the processes in place for dialogue and discussion. We need the global benchmarks that provide an orientation, but then we need the actual implementing standards and the dynamic interplay between the implementers and the benchmarks and the communities that are affected. And that is always going to be a process. It's never going to be perfect. The world's not perfect. Supply chains are by far not perfect, and due diligence is never going to be 100% give you 100% guarantee of responsible sourcing. And I think we need to think about also like the behavioral dynamics and insights here. And there's a difference between alignment and convergence. And we really focus on that nuance quite a lot, because we think that the various different standards can align with the global benchmarks, but it's extremely unlikely that the whole market is going to converge around one standard to implement, because people have sunk costs, they have confirmation bias, they have the desire to be socially cohesive with their peers and therefore follow what their peers are doing. And all of those things mean there's going to be a multiplicity of implementing standards. That is okay. That's good. But we need alignment with the global benchmarks and a constant process to reflect on, are we doing the right thing? Are we having the impact that we are? And we're not there yet, but I think we have those dialogue platforms and we have those communication lines emerging.
Right, okay. Tobias, bring you in on this one.
I will be rather short, but I think it's important to also mention that, of course, it shall take time and will take time. But sometimes I also will say that, at least from politics, it's all about timing. When can you introduce the new policy measures? And I'm a regulator commonly from a state side, but of course, this can be without so much of any evidence that we actually don't understand how the downstream and upstream are affected by these new measures. That we don't have the exercise, but it was time. It was the right time to introduce the new policy measures, and that also creates difficulties and challenges, which makes it more difficult to align or get consensus in standards and regulations. So it takes time, most of the times.
Let's hope we have time. And Bryce, you wanted to come in on this as well, yeah?
Yes, I just want to say, in my eyes, I joined this responsible sourcing team back to 2016. At the beginning, very, very, very few upstream companies, especially Chinese firms, really into this conversation. But these days, we can say from OECD, from Tyler, we have you can see more Asian faces, especially from China, to talk about these topics. I think this is the first one, awareness rising. The second thing's about like without upstreams, so then the conversation is not fair. So that's one of the major things RCI was going to talk about, like under the OECD guidances. So we're trying to talk about standards, which is fair and applicable and also realistic for both the upstream and the downstream. So, and also we talk about transparency, not only transparency to upstreams, but also downstreams. You also have to be transparent. So we're having kind of like a fair conversations like that. And I agree with Tobias, this takes time, but also we need the right approach. I see the hopes, but also the companies like us, we are having a commitment, but we do need a fair table with all the participators on the table. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I just want to explore this one step further forward. Well, Fiona, you were going to come back. I like your conversation.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Conversation, yes. I just wanted to follow on from Bryce and the point about China. We know that so much of metal production is in China for aluminium. More than half of the world's aluminium is produced and used in China. And we've done a lot of work in outreach in China so that they are part of that conversation. A third of our upstream members are China-based. And I think bringing kind of the work of international benchmarks, obviously the CCCMC have worked on OECD, but that's been mainly focused on perhaps cobalt and the 3TG sort of complex minerals. So we're also extending that work, but it is all part of this kind of jigsaw of kind of working out through these different stakeholder groups as various have described. And I think Taylor talked about very nicely, we've got these kind of overarching mechanisms, but we do need kind of local, regional, commodity, whatever, groups people together so that they have that sense of ownership and commitment to making things happen on the ground.
Can I also just throw another layer onto this, particularly looking from the business perspective? And it's, I want an honest response from you. I read and I get a feel that there is an extraordinary business psychology transformation going on at the moment. People are, rather than saying, oh, climate change is, that's some risk somewhere on a register, people are actually realizing it's them, their lives, their families, and thinking that through business, we really, instead of looking at these as risks and problems to a business model, we actually are becoming part of the solution and having we talked about empathy yesterday, rather than it being a problem that we've got to solve, how can we be part of the right side of history? Now, I'm interested, is there just some really sophisticated greenwashing going on here? Or are you sensing in the boardrooms and the key decision-making places that there's an actual sea change in outlook of what's the point of business and what are we trying to achieve, which could be extraordinarily powerful in shifting and accelerating the pace and the thought, the wisdom of moving into this, further into this space? Or am I just a fool? It's a grubby old world out there, and it always will be. Bryce, how about a response to that?
I just try to touch my face. But anyway, so seriously, I was in this company for 15 years. So my company is really serious about this direction. So as you see, the main application for cobalt is lithium-ion battery materials for the new EV sector. The EV sector gonna save a lot of carbon emissions, mainly produced by the traditional gas car. So this is really serious. And also my commitment of responsible sourcing from a company is being committed in the whole world, in front of the whole world by journalists, by Amnesty International back to 2016, by my chairman himself. So it's also serious. And also some of the problems reported by the journalists, you have to be kidding. You have to be kidding. So are we so bad, entrepreneurs today even? We have to be realistic.
Okay, just any other brief responses to that, Tyler, and then Rebecca.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're getting there, but we're not there yet. I mean, and it has to do why I spent so much talking about all those drivers. And I think what we see is the more regulation that comes, or the more market requirements or the downstream requirements that come on play, the more attention that is going to be grabbed at the board level of these issues, because it becomes ingrained into doing business. If I can't trade on the LME or a gold market because I haven't met those requirements, that is a massive commercial impact on me. So I think we shouldn't fool ourselves to think it's all like because of good ethics. I think, there are business considerations here. Where are we on the journey? I would say that we've seen that in some, some industries are far ahead in adopting policies and systems. We're still far away, though, from seeing the impact on the ground I think that we want. I mean, there are some good examples, but they're not brought to scale. And part of the reason for that is that while it's becoming a commercial issue, it's still not exactly, I think, priced in. There's not the commercial incentives to do good. And you're seeing in the chat a lot of discussion around that. And we're working on that. We're studying this issue about value and cost and supply chain. But I think that's it. If the market pays for responsibly good produced metal, then there will become more and more in the boardroom taken seriously.
Yeah, well, we want it good, and we want it cheap. Rebecca, maybe and the trouble is we still want it. Rebecca, a thought from you.
I will offer I actually will offer a slightly different perspective on that. And just to say that when we started out, we actually saw mostly jewelers engaged in IRMA. The two members of our early board were actually from the jewelry sector, realizing that those materials, right, when you have gold, platinum, who have higher potentially profit margins, then that could change, then maybe that would incentivize them to act more responsibly. But what I'll say, and Peter, you said, is there a sea change? Is there change happening out there? We are seeing it, actually. We're seeing that the mining companies that are coming in now are actually focused very much on what might be seen as more lower value commodities, iron ore, nickel, the types of commodities that ultimately need to fuel the transition to the new green economy. And what the reason that they're coming in, and I think this actually speaks to some hope, is that those who are selling the renewables, the electric cars, all of the different consumer-facing products that actually want to help us transition to a green economy, they're realizing that there's a promise that they're making, right, in terms of helping us transition. And they're realizing they can't make a promise that we're being more responsible as a society while also knowing that the materials that they're using could be tainted, whether by environmental or social harm. And so I do think that we're actually seeing that, if I can offer a bit of hope on that side.
Okay, I mean, just interested, maybe come to you, Tobias, just on that, just that same question, whether you're sensing that they're genuinely in your conversations with business, just that sea change taking place in terms of wisdom and living this stuff, or whether you're dealing with very sophisticated CSR and not getting to the heart and soul of companies and change.
What I have seen, at least, is that if you can't look into the supply chain downstream or upstream, it works almost only when you have a strong regulation, put pressure on the business. Otherwise, you have always weaknesses. But at the same time, we also add, because I see this transition, and one big driver, at least I have found in Sweden and other European countries, is also, which is not mentioned, is the business, and they have to attract young people. And now you will attract the millennials. And they have much more interest in sustainability and much more interest in responsible sourcing. So they have to show that they are a good company to attract these young talent people. Otherwise, they choose another company. So that driver gets more important. And I believe it also will be even more important in the coming years.
Okay, as ever on these conversations, a brief one, Fiona, then I'm going to come for just a round of final remarks. Yeah.
Sure. So yeah, I just wanted to follow on that. I think aluminium, and I think Rebecca touched on this, it's for some time been seen itself as a kind of a greener choice, if you like. It's been used to lightweight vehicles. It's part of sort of battery housing as vehicles become electrified, thermal efficiency in buildings, lightweight packaging, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think, back in 2009 is even when those corrective questions were being asked. So I've been very heightened in this commodity sector, being very encouraged about what seems to be a genuine commitment. And what I've seen over, again, the last 12 months with the pandemic, where we had to put in place policies for remote auditing and things like that, our initial expectation was that companies, when they were at various points of the certification cycle, would say, and we gave them the option to wait, let's wait to kind of see when auditors get to site. But instead, people wanted remote options that at least partially covered it, that kept the momentum. So that to us was a really strong signal that this was genuine. It wasn't just like, oh, we're being told to, we've got to meet the schedule. They wanted to keep pushing, even though we gave them the option, because of the complexity and the dynamic nature of what was happening in the pandemic, to relax for a moment or to wait. So I think that the last 12 months have given people also the opportunity to reflect on these kind of societal challenges and to really step up to, okay, we're going to kind of focus on what's in our business and what we can do now. And these sustainability challenges are something we can be working on.
Okay, time is never our friend. I'm going to come round to all of you for a final comment. There's so many dimensions to this conversation, and we've got some thoughts in the chat. This will all feed into the resourcing project. But Constanza, I think you're there with the little mural, because we want to really get from this conversation. I just want to get maybe one unexpected but key message from you. We're talking about trying to create that level playing field in responsible sourcing. We're talking about the interplay between public policy making and business initiatives, regulation, standards, etc. As we look over the next 3, 4, 5 years, if you had one particular message, and I tried to confine you to one, even though I know you've shared, each of you, 20, really good. But if there was one you really wanted to draw out that just gave us a jolt and thought, that was helping us take that journey forwards, what would that message be, particularly related to regulation standards? So who would like to start? Rebecca.
Very happy to. Very happy to. I'll speak just really directly to this point of government and standards. What's the interplay between policy and standards? And I think when you have multi-stakeholders come around the table and say, this is good practice. Someone said in the comments, we should be using good practice rather than best practice. Good practice or best practice now as we know it. When you have a multi-stakeholder group come around the table and say, this is best practice as we know it, it actually serves as a template for governments to say, this has been an agreed upon process by all of the stakeholders that we care about, businesses, civil society, our workforce. And we can actually use that as a template to do what we know that we want to do, which is to protect society and environment in our country. So that's what I would say. It's really a collaborative like synergy between the two.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'll come to Bryce and have a thought for Constanza, who's compressing your message into a simple statement. So Bryce, what would your message to take us forward in this arena be?
Yeah, I'm thinking, because I think, firstly, responsible sourcing should be a shared responsibility under a fair platform. So this is my first one, first part of the sentence. I think it should be a shared responsibility. And also we have to do the right thing for all the stakeholders to have a win-win situation. Right. So that's my conclusion. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. I'll come across to Fiona.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, my short sentence would be building supply chain ownership to drive implementation.
Lovely. And that will be music to Tobias's ear.
Short and sweet.
Who worries it only goes so far and then sort of we lose the plot. Tobias, could I bring you in, please?
Fiona had music in my ears, so I could copy, but I take a step back and then I would say objective information and market analysis of the supply chains. And of course, this shall be transparent and public available. So they can agree this ownership and also have a multi-stakeholder discussion.
Okay, so conversations, around the reality of what's going on out there. Okay, thank you very much indeed for that, Tobias. And finally, Tobias, Tyler, you kicked us off. Just a word before you offer your statement. There was a question that's saying, obviously you've focused on, the high risk issues. There was a specific question saying whether you're going to broaden from just those severe risk categories in your work, and after that come to a key exit message.
Yeah, well, just to that question, thank you for the question. We don't have a mandate right now to broaden the scope, and it's a very complex exercise, but we do have a mandate to reflect on how well we're implemented and what needs to be done and report to the OECD Council, which is the real board of ministers that oversee us. So I think our next reporting is next year, and that is where we would raise that, the market is moving on and looking at these other things, and is it time to open this up? I would say that the OECD due diligence guidance fits within a bigger universe of responsible business conduct standards at the OECD, which is our OECD guidelines and a general framework. So we really see the minerals guidance as the first step, but as a stepping stone to creating and implementing already across a broader risk area. So no intention, but we're following it and we will report it to council. And I think there will be an exercise to look at whether that's useful.
Right.
Now, I think a lot of has been said. So I think, but to really focus on the question that you ask, what is the role of regulations? I think regulations make soft law with hard consequences, and essentially they take the voluntary stuff and help them bite. So they make hard consequences for what is generally voluntary or soft law, but those consequences are diverse still. And I think it's still a bit of a mess. So I think there's still work to be done.
Okay. Tyler, thank you very much. Rebecca, Tobias, Bryce, and Fiona. Really interesting feed into this conversation. It's a huge topic, but we hope that this conversation will be partly feeding into some of the thoughts emerging in session 6 this afternoon, but also into the 4-year resourcing program. How can this sort of independent sort of view nourish thoughts about taking forward activity, particularly within that standards regulation sphere. So thank you to all our speakers. We've also captured everything on the chat, and even though we may not have brought them into the conversation, they will all be contributing to the behind the scenes discourse. Do keep that chat going if you would like. We're going to break for some lunch now, unless you happen to be just waking up or just about to go to bed, in which case have the refreshment of your choice. And then we're going to be back at 1 o'clock European time and looking at the issue of investment and stock and commodity markets, that whole area of how the financial world can impact upon the journey towards responsible sourcing. We hope you found this panel discussion really interesting, certainly stimulated a lot of thought in my own mind, and we'll see you back at 1 o'clock this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed. Enjoy the break.